Well, let me start by saying that its power is also its limitation. So there's a reason it's the first question, and we move past that limitation pretty quickly. The power is that whereas many people struggle when asked to present an idea, most of us have no problem talking about what should work differently, right? And I often, when I'm working in workshops with would-be business owners or folks who are trying to do corporate entrepreneurial innovation, what I ask them is, what in industry, in society, or in everyday life? Now, the great thing is that people get very excited when trying to answer this question, because they stop and they say, well, why does this not work the way it ought to? Now, the limitations of that excitement are that you also get a lot of folks who, I don't know, want to improve the MTA in New York or something like that, these frustrations that, but even that is indicative, because I actually think, and we can get into the other 4 questions in detail, but almost the biggest takeaway that I've learned as I've been doing these live for a little over a year now is that it's the blocks, it's what's keeping it from working differently, actually, that elicits, it's analyzing what's keeping it from working differently that elicits the innovation, right? Sometimes it's a business model issue, sometimes it's an industry structure issue, sometimes it's a regulatory issue, sometimes it's a technological, complementary technologies issues, an adoption problem, right? When entrepreneurs get around what's blocking it from working differently, then I find something extraordinary happens, which is they move away from some of these Me Too ideas. These, wow, wouldn't that be cool, but either Google could do it in 5 seconds, or there's 20 different competitors that, did you take a moment and look online on competitive landscape, or yeah, you could do it differently and no one will ever pay you for that, or they tend to get past those questions when focused on that block, because that's really understanding. I mean, we have this concept that that I've developed called dangling value, right? And the idea of dangling value, here I'll use an example. I had a guest speaker from the CEO of a company called Keaton Rowe. I think she did her MBA at an inferior institution in Massachusetts. At any rate, she has created a business where there are amateur stylists, right? So folks who will help you figure out how to do your outfits and your hair or your attire. And then there's mostly women and some men, but there are people who would like the services of a stylist, right? Now, in this case, what's great is that there's all kinds of value sitting there in the marketplace, right? Because in the past, those amateur stylists haven't had a market. They help their friends. And those people who would like to have a stylist, they ask their friends, right? But by creating a platform for that, suddenly we have a basis for assessing the value of all that expertise. I think it's one of the most powerful, and we're only beginning to utilize this. One of the most powerful aspects of digital is simply the ability to value skill sets that used to be just something you did for your friends. At any rate, when you create a market out of it, suddenly people who weren't making careers of that, they get a reputation, right? So the reason that value is dangling is that in that case, there was simply no platform for creating a market out of it. And that's value creation. Now, there's other kinds of dangling value. And the case that's often helpful, this is a little more sophisticated, but so there's creating something, there's meeting a need, right? Addressing a pain point in the market. And then there's, well, where in the value chain for that pain point are you going to make money on it? Something that I really press entrepreneurs with is that value put in is not the same as value taken out, right? And there's a million examples from, who makes more money is one I always start with, the Coca-Cola or the bottling companies. Well, truth is Coke buys and sells its bottling companies routinely. But in the end, well, that's high risk being a bottler, very capital intensive, right? But there's only one brand, right? So this is a concept that I learned actually from John Shank at Tuck, which is that, when you look at a value chain, you want to think about the supply and demand relationship, the negotiating relationship at each node in the chain, right? And that the money is made and this is not Shank's terms, this is the way I explain it to undergraduates, when I need you more than you need me, you make the money, right? And so often you have entrepreneurs who are not in what we call the sweet spot in the value chain, but where many of the most extraordinary innovation opportunities emerge is when that sweet spot is shifting. So there's an exercise that my partners and I do where we ask the business owner, often a business owner who's actually in a low value position in that chain, we say, what's an example of an industry where the sweet spot in the value chain has shifted, right? And the classic one I use to illustrate this is what happened in books, right? Where when I was a boy, you had the publishers were very powerful, right? And then the superstores took some of that value away, Barnes and Noble and Borders, because they had more negotiating power because they owned the customer increasingly, and they could get great rates on those books from the publisher, right? And then, of course, Jeff Bezos said, actually, I'm going to pay publishers much less, and they're going to say, thank you, sir, may I have another, right? If it's not too off-color to quote John Belushi films. At any rate, the point here is that he actually drove a shifting sweet spot in the value chain, right? The other example I often give is iTunes, where there was all this dangling value, and this is where this comes around, from the kids I grew up with who would drop, I don't know where they got all this money, $80 in a routine trip to Tower Records, right? Well, suddenly you have the age of Napster. The average kid, maybe it's not the best quality, and of course we all love vinyl now, but doesn't have to spend $70 for access to those records, right? And so the truth is, however, that money still wanted to be spent, right? And so I think that the real brilliance of Steve Jobs was to figure out that he could get people to spend it on the device. If the device, it's just a hard drive, right? But there's a big old premium on that hard drive, because that became the expenditure on the music and the cool factor that kids were after.